Hello everyone, Alexa Donne here, and I am a traditionally published author who wants to talk to you today about the rampant misconception in the publishing community, especially in the self-publishing community, that editors ruin books. That essentially, when you do traditional publishing and you work with an editor, that they make you change things, that you lose all control of your work, and thus traditional publishing is not good if you want to retain creative control and the vision of your work. Now, I hesitate to do a specific call out, but in this case it is necessary just because this misconception really only exists in the self-publishing community, and when people are considering self-publishing versus traditional publishing, I think this misconception really often gets in the way. So I want to speak to you as a traditionally published author and let you know what it's really like to work with an editor, and to put to rest once and for all, hopefully, that editors don't ruin your book. That is just not something that happens. I think it's really important for people making a decision about what publishing path is best for them, because there are legitimate pros and cons to both of them, to know the truth about this one so that it isn't the deciding factor in their decision of which way to go. So yeah, let's just lay it on the table and get it out of the way. When you are being traditionally published and you are working with editors at your publishing house, you always retain ultimate and final creative control because you are the author. You control the writing. The book is yours. Now, of course, do you end up making changes as you work with an editor? Of course you do, but that's the point of working with an editor. So I want to talk a bit about what a healthy editorial relationship is between an author and an editor, and what actually happens when you are working with an editor at a traditional publishing house. Though I will say, even if you do self-publishing, if you hire the right freelance editor to work with you on your self-publishing project, developmental editor, you should be doing this kind of work anyway. Doing healthy and real developmental edits to a book project should happen no matter which path you choose. And I think that's where the fundamental misunderstanding comes from. That the benefit to self-publishing is that you can just throw up the book of your heart, whatever it is that you want, because it's exactly what you want and it's perfect, and that is the better solution. When really, if you're a serious writer who wants to level up and create the best book possible, you should always be willing to engage critically with your work, especially first drafts, with a professional editor who has experience and knows, about story and craft, to make real and substantive changes to your story to make it better. Ultimately, that is what editing is. There are different levels of editing. There's kind of cosmetic editing, which can include copy editing. Of course, copy editing is essential, but it's still cosmetic to, delete a word here or change a typo, deal with a comma somewhere or capitalization. Those are very surface changes that you're going to make to your book. Line editing also in a lot of ways is surface editing. Delete a line here, maybe move it around, alter meaning. That is all well and good, and those are editorial stages you do need to go through on your book. But those things are not developmental editing. And when I talk about revision on this channel, when I talk about revising your book before you query or revising your book with your editor, this means push up your sleeve, deep developmental editing. Now, every book is going to need a different kind of level of editing, but trust me, all professional writers, including those who are traditionally published, but people who take writing and producing the best story and book possible, do real editing to their book. No one is publishing a first draft. She says, saying, I know there are the occasional unicorn authors, but they're unicorn authors. I'd say 99% of authors really need to do real and substantial editing. This doesn't always mean a rewrite, but it does mean really digging into things like character motivations and character arcs, pacing, and being willing to engage with your own work and go, I know it's not perfect, and I'm willing to do what it takes to make this read better and a better reading experience for the reader. So what actually happens when you're working with a professional editor in traditional publishing? So you're going to get an edit letter from your editor, and this is basically like a top line view of what they found when they were reading your book, some of the issues they had, also some of the things that they like, and it's going to paint a picture for you of what's working versus what isn't working. And then most editors, not all, but most, they leave it to you. It is your job as the author to make the creative decisions and decide how you're going to change things, how you're going to get to the finish line. The editor tells you, I'm not feeling this character's agency. So then you have to figure out how to change their agency, how to make it work, how to give them agency. Now, your editor might suggest, this did happen to me, oh, what if you did X? And then I simply went, I don't really like X, I'm gonna do Y. And I did it my own way. That's because I retain ultimate creative control of my book. My editor can't make me change anything. I think a lot of the fear-mongering of, oh, editors will ruin my book, ruin my vision, it's no longer my book when I do traditional publishing, which is kind of true, it is a joint effort, but it is always your book, it's always your name on the book when it's published. I think it comes from this oddly misplaced fear that you write X, you write one kind of book with one kind of story, and then traditional publishing will take it and go, write a completely different book, we only want it if it's a completely different book. And this is just really odd to me because if they don't like the book, they're not going to buy the book. So you're just not going to end up in a situation where someone buys your book and then says, write a completely different one, make us happy, dance, dance monkey, dance. It doesn't really happen that way. So that's why I think this fear is really misplaced, because in most healthy editorial relationships, it's a conversation. You're working with a professional who is an expert in story and an expert in publishing fiction, specifically usually commercial fiction. So of course you should want to listen to them and engage with them and work with them to make your book better, because if you do that, you have a better chance of breaking out, of reaching more readers, selling more copies, and having a career. So I make this video and debunk this myth to encourage you to be more open to having that kind of relationship with an editor, regardless of your path. It can only be a good thing when you dig in and engage with your work and make real changes to make it work better. But I do want to talk about where I actually think this myth is coming from whence it has developed, and I do hate to concede this point, but I'm all about real talk, and I am not a hypocrite. I think this myth has come from actual true stories. I think those actual true stories represent less than 1% of publishing experiences, but I do think it has happened, and I can think of a few examples that I can't share because I don't spill secrets. Very, very, very rarely, it's less than 1% of cases, you do have a situation where a publisher acquires a book and the editor basically thought of the book, you come to discover after the deal has been done, as almost like a lump of clay. That lump of clay had so much potential, and maybe you had it sculpted into, I don't know, a cup, but they have a vision of reworking the clay into a beautiful tower. It does happen every once in a while where your book is acquired and your editor does want you to do big fundamental changes to your book. But it does still stand that you retain creative control and you can say no. Now, if you say no in some of these extreme cases, so extreme and so rare that I promise you watching this, it's not gonna happen to you, it can end up meaning the contract needs to die. Like, you have to break your contract, give back the money, and so on. And that's something that you discuss with your agent, because you should be doing these deals with a literary agent by your side. But honestly, what usually happens in these cases when you sign with an editor and they do want much more major developmental edits than is usual, usually the author takes a deep breath and they figure it out, they do it, and they usually end up with a book that they're also happy with. It can be a harrowing experience, but seriously, it's so, so rare. But I think this is where the rumor started, so to speak. generally when someone has a bad experience with something, if they have a negative opinion or review, they're always going to shout the loudest. It's the outlier negative thing that always is trumpeted from the rooftop. So I think this probably has happened to a few people, and it has become the prevailing myth of, oh, if you're in traditional publishing, they're always going to want to fundamentally change your book. And it's just usually not true. And I know you're thinking, well, Alexa, why should I take the risk? Well, you should take the risk because 99.9% is pretty good odds. I can tell you this doesn't reflect my experience or the experience of a majority of my friends. And the few people I do know personally, so I do know people this has kind of happened to. It wasn't a page one rewrite. It wasn't you gave me this book and I bought this book and I want a completely different book. But sometimes it did mean they wanted the overarching plot arc to be different. They did want big changes to character motivation. And yes, it was a big undertaking, but it wasn't as drastic as I think the mythos has taken on. It wasn't, I hear a lot in YouTube comments, the whole idea of the fear mongering of, I've written this book and they're gonna make me make it gay. No publisher is going to make you add LGBTQ elements if that isn't what the book is. That just doesn't happen. The same thing with adding racial diversity. Trust me, if you have written the kind of book and are the kind of author where this is going to be a problem, trust me, publishing does not want you to write a racially diverse work. So I think that's just kind of people really exaggerating what's going to be happening in publishing. You're also not going to see the extremes of you write in one genre and you sell it and then they're going to make you completely change it into another genre. That's also just kind of an extreme thing that doesn't happen. So I think that's where this has come from. It started as like a, oh, did you hear this thing happen to this person? And it probably was, oh, an editor wanted a completely different character arc or to change the inciting incident or what have you, and it ballooned into the editor made them write a completely different book and it wasn't even the same, and that author had such a bad experience with publishing. And you know, maybe that author did have a really bad experience with publishing, but it's just not the norm. So this is me telling you, seriously, editors don't ruin books. Please stop saying that, because especially when you hear it as a traditionally published author, it can't help going through your mind that like basically the individual saying this think you're weak, that you're weak because you know, and shallow because you wanted to go through the traditional publishing process and have your book in bookstores, so you bent to the will of your editor. And it's just not true. I mean, honestly, perhaps I have more confidence than the average bear, but honestly, when my editor has suggested things I don't want to do, I just say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then I don't do that thing. You always should, of course, choose your hills to die on. You should do most of the edits that your editor suggests because it is a partnership, but you do that and you are as pleasant as possible to work with, so you can die on those hills. I have had those hills and I've just said no, and it was no big deal. I have felt that every step of my publishing process has been collaborative and has led to better books. So that is my 2 cents on this topic. Please, if you are perpetuating this idea, stop. It's just not true. And editors ruining books is the worst reason to decide between traditional publishing versus self-publishing, because as I said, if you're self-publishing, you should be hiring a great developmental editor who's going to help you dig in and make your book super awesome before you publish. So let's stop doing this self-publishing versus traditional publishing thing with editors ruining books being the linchpin. So that's my soapbox for the day. Thank you so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will make more videos kind of talking about the real things that go on in traditional publishing. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and as always, happy writing and happy publishing.